Is Spencer Rattler versus Drake Maye the biggest storyline? Yes. The easiest storyline? Also yes. The laziest storyline? The answer is also yes.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I am Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and you can find my written work over on Gamecocks Digest on SI.com. Thank y'all so much once again for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Gamecock fans, we have officially made it. It is game week for Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks as they are set to take on the North Carolina Tar Heels later this week on Saturday night in Charlotte, North Carolina. It is going to be one of the biggest matchups of the entire weekend. But there's also a matchup within the matchup that's been talked about a lot heading into this season, and that is the quarterback matchup, I guess, between Spencer Rattler and Drake Maye, which will be the biggest and easiest storyline to talk about this week. But it's also the laziest one, and it sort of encapsulates what the national college football media space is like. I'm not going to sit here and act like that I'm not going to discuss this storyline at all this week, because I will talk about it. I will be talking about it in some capacity on our Tuesday show here, and I'm sure that Locked On Tar Heels host Isaac Shade and myself will be talking about it on our crossover show that we do later this week. It's the biggest storyline of this matchup because Spencer Rattler and Drake Maye are both recognizable names for different reasons. Spencer Rattler, he's the star quarterback and former preseason Heisman favorite that had a fall from grace 2 years ago. And up until the latter part of the regular season last year, it sort of looked like that his career was just taking a real downward turn. And then the Tennessee and Clemson games happened, and now the entire narrative has completely changed for the better for Spencer Rattler. Drake Maye, he plays for a school where his last name is revered because of what his father did in football and what his older brother did in men's basketball just a few years ago. And he exploded onto the national scene this past fall with the numbers that he put up. And it's also the easiest storyline because they both happen to play quarterback for South and North Carolina. But this easy, eye-catching storyline, it is also lazy, and if it wasn't at the beginning of the offseason, it certainly is at this point heading into this week one matchup. Because what's happened over the course of this offseason, and especially over the past couple of months during talking season, is that this storyline has become the only one that people are focusing on with this game. And it's led a lot of people to make their prediction solely off of this storyline. And this is how those people are breaking it down. They're looking at last season's stats. They're looking at the Heisman odds for this fall and the NFL draft odds for next April. And they just conclude, well, Drake Maye's clearly the better quarterback between these two guys. So North Carolina's going to win the game. Those people, in my opinion, are going to look foolish once this game takes place, but we'll of course break that down in more detail as this entire week continues to progress. But the majority of the people that are falling into this trap with this storyline, they are national media folks, and it displays what that space is like when it comes to the sport of college football. And that's what makes the Locked On Podcast Network different. It's what makes the Locked On Gamecocks podcast different from probably all the other podcasts that you listen to on South Carolina. I don't try to act like that I know every single team like the back of my hand, although I do try my hardest to gauge what they could do in the upcoming season by grading some of their coaches, by paying attention to their recruiting rankings and what all they've done in terms of accumulating talent, by watching game film, by tracking their seasons as it is ongoing, making rational opinions based on all of that studying. But at the end of the day, I do not use lazy storylines like this one to make my final conclusions. Look at College Game Day, for example. This past Saturday, they all made their picks on who they thought would win the conference championship in each Power 5 conference. And when it came time to talk about the SEC, what did everyone on that set do outside of Reese Davis? They picked the Alabama Crimson Tide. Desmond Howard picked him, Pat McAfee picked him, and Kirk Herbstreit picked him. That is a lazy narrative to attach your wagon to, because everybody's just talking about how, well, Alabama's back's against the wall, Nick Saban's being told his dynasty is dead. You never want to doubt a Nick Saban-led football team. Just when they seem like that they're down for the count, they get right back up and they punch you right in the mouth. Everybody is starting to seemingly fall in line with that narrative as we get closer to this season. That's just one example of how the national media space operates in the sport. And again, it's why this network is different. When I talk with Isaac Shade later this week on our crossover show, I am not going to sit there and act like that I know about North Carolina's football team more than he does, because I do not. And on the other hand, Isaac Shade is not going to sit there and act like he knows more about South Carolina's football team than I do, because he doesn't. And we both can sit there and make rational opinions about this game with what we know and combining our knowledge together. It's what makes this network different. Bottom line, North Carolina can thank the national media space for not just making the Spencer Rattler versus Drake Maye storyline the only one that everybody is talking about and putting their eyes on, but also it's the reason for why the majority of people and money is behind the North Carolina Tar Heels as this game approaches. Is it the biggest storyline? 1,000%. Is it easy? Also 1,000%. But it's also the laziest storyline because most people are not looking at this game beyond that storyline. And so for the rest of this show, I want to bring some attention to other storylines that do need to be put in the limelight more, that do need to be discussed more. Storylines that could very well also play a big role in deciding who wins this football game this coming weekend. We'll discuss all of that for the rest of today's edition of Locked On Gamecocks. Now, time for your Game Changer of the Week, brought to you by Athletic Brewing Company. Much like the South Carolina Gamecocks, Athletic Brewing has completely changed the non-alcoholic beer game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good. The South Carolina Gamecocks have increased their win total each of the last 2 seasons. This included wins over top 10 teams in Tennessee and Clemson last fall. Athletic Brewing Company brews over 50 styles of craft non-alcoholic beers that includes IPAs, Goldens, Sours, and more. And the best part is you'll never have hangovers when you drink these non-alcoholic beers. You can find Athletic Brewing Company's non-alcoholic brews at a store near you or buy online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Near beer. Exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company. Fit for all times. Welcome back to this Monday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, thank you to each and every one of you everydayers for making us your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage, both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Be sure to stick around for the rest of this week as we continue breaking down South Carolina's Week 1 matchup against the North Carolina Tar Heels, all right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Now, let's cover some of these other storylines that are going to be ones to watch heading into this contest. Storylines that, quite frankly, aren't being discussed by almost anybody, especially on the national stage. So let's start off with storyline number 1. Which quarterback offensive coordinator pairing has the better debut in week 1? Both schools are bringing in new offensive coordinators heading into 2023. South Carolina, of course, brought in Arkansas tight ends coach Dowell Loggains this offseason, a man that has plenty of experience at the NFL level and also, again, spent the last couple years as Arkansas's tight end coach. North Carolina, on the flip side of the coin, brought in Chip Lindsey, who served as UCF's offensive coordinator this past fall and 2 years ago was Troy's head coach. I mentioned that because the Gamecocks faced off against the Troy Trojans in 2021. Now, of course, we've heard a ton of great things about Dowell Loggains and Spencer Rattler's relationship, both when it comes to their personal relationship as a player and a coach, and also their working relationship in regards to trying to construct this playbook, this scheme around Spencer Rattler's strengths. In terms of Chip Lindsey coming to Chapel Hill, I don't completely understand this move in all honesty, because Chip Lindsey, he's a Gus Malzahn disciple. This is a guy that runs a lot of spread option concepts in this offense. Now, he does have experience in the air raid system, which is the system that North Carolina has been running for the last few years under former offensive coordinator Phil Longo, but the spread option is an offensive system that involves a lot more quarterback runs. It involves a lot more option concepts in the backfield, but it still maintains a power run or gap run type of scheme that is all about assignment blocking and essentially hitting a certain hole on the football field. Now, obviously, I'm not sitting here and saying that North Carolina is going to all of a sudden make Drake Maye run with the football more than he throws the football, because that'd be pretty doggone stupid, to be honest, and I don't think that Mack Brown is going to do something like that or allow that to happen to a star quarterback, but it could make for an interesting chess match between Chip Lindsey, UNC's offensive coordinator, and South Carolina defensive coordinator Clayton White. So that is without a doubt a storyline to watch as we get closer and closer to this game taking place. The second storyline that I want to talk about is who will win the battle in the trenches when it comes to the passing game. South Carolina, North Carolina. Let's take this back to the Spencer Rattler versus Drake Maye storyline that we talked about at the start of the show. For people who maybe would push back on me saying that that's a lazy narrative and it's lazy to just narrow it down to the quarterbacks, one of their arguments might be, well, both defenses, quite frankly, stunk last year, and both offensive lines have been questionable. So, two very important areas of your team right there, both of them essentially cancel each other out in terms of bad performance based on what happened last year. And to a certain degree, that might be true, but if you're going to stick with that talking point, then we got to talk about how South Carolina, even if the gap's not that large, is better than North Carolina when it comes to their pass protection and rushing the quarterback. North Carolina allowed 40 sacks in 2022. South Carolina allowed 31. North Carolina only recorded 17 sacks on defense this past fall. South Carolina recorded 20. And keep this in mind, the Tar Heels played one extra game compared to the Gamecocks, the ACC championship game. Oh, and speaking of ACC, they played ACC level competition. Talent-wise, it's viewed as one of the bottom two conferences at the Power 5 level. Certainly nowhere near close to where the SEC stands in terms of overall talent. The other thing to know with this storyline here is both programs have new coaches on both sides of the ball. North Carolina brought in a new offensive line coach in Randy Clements, who came from North Texas, and he is a part of that air raid coaching tree, so it is a good fit in terms of what he believes, I guess, schematically, alongside offensive coordinator Chip Lindsey. Now, South Carolina, they basically promoted former offensive analyst Lonnie Teasley to be the full-time offensive line coach and take over for Greg Atkins. Lonnie Teasley has never been a full-time offensive line coach at this level, but based on the returns, he is a guy that's all about the technical aspects of the position. He's all about the details, and he also has some NFL experience. So that's probably where he got his teaching methods from for the most part. And then you talk about defensive tackles coach Travian Robertson. In my opinion, was certainly a fantastic hire, both in terms of what he brings to this program as a former player here, but also with how he teaches the interior defensive linemen. Much like Lonnie Teasley, all about the technical aspects, all about hand movement, all about getting yourself leverage through your hand movement. So many different things that I think is going to help some of those guys out in 2023. So in terms of the, lack of success production-wise in 2022 and some of the coaching changes that I just mentioned, this is without a doubt a storyline to watch. And for some reason, you haven't heard that get discussed very much, at least up till this week. And when I come back in just a couple moments, I'm going to discuss one more storyline that you should all pay attention to, this one on the defensive side of the ball. We'll dive into that one in just a few moments. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Now, the thing about these neutral site games is the ticket allocation is always split 50-50 between both schools. And for South Carolina fans, that could be a bit of a problem because if you're someone that's on the fence about going to the game, the tickets might get gobbled up before you can even think about buying one, and that could make you really, really stressed out. So if you're a bit worried about being left out, don't, because Game Time has got you covered. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. They're easy to buy, you can get images of where your seats are located, and they're sent directly to your phone. It sounds easy, because it is easy. Snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Okay, the last storyline that I want to discuss on today's show is which team's secondary overcomes their losses the best in week one. South Carolina and North Carolina both lost a couple defensive backs from their squad this past season in different ways. For South Carolina, they lost Cam Smith and Darius Rush both to the NFL, basically losing their starting nickel corner and one of their starting outside corners. Now, O'Donnell Fortune and one of either David Spalding or Keenan Nelson Jr. is expected to take over those spots, and the Gamecocks, I think, feel pretty comfortable about where they currently stand in their secondary, especially considering the fact that they're led by defensive backs coach Torian Gray. Now, for North Carolina, they lost 3 starters from last year to the transfer portal. Storm Duck and Cameron Kelly both transferred to Louisville, and Tony Grimes transferred to Texas A&M. Now, some North Carolina fans might argue that these losses are addition by subtraction because this unit wasn't very good last year. But I don't fully buy that, in all honesty. Some of these guys were doing really well in this defense before defensive coordinator Gene Chizik ever arrived here. And to tell you the truth, I think that Gene Chizik is the reason why this secondary and this pass rush did not do so well in 2022. Now, if it is a bit of a talent issue, maybe they just misevaluated a couple of these guys. North Carolina got a lot of guys from the portal this past offseason, adding guys like cornerback Elijah Husey from East Tennessee State, Antavius Lane from Georgia State, Derek Allen from Georgia Tech, and Armani Chapman from Virginia Tech. Now, do either of these guys jump off the page as a potential, not just day one starter, but also someone that could be an all-ACC defensive back? Someone that can go up against a Juice Wells, an Xavier Legette, an Amari Brown, or maybe some of these other guys? That remains to be seen. But the point here is South Carolina, North Carolina, their secondaries, for one reason or another, look different from this past fall. So again, if people out there are going to narrow down this matchup to the quarterbacks and Spencer Rattler and Drake Maye, then this is a storyline that you should absolutely be talking about and focused on more so than maybe you have been to this point. It could be one of the factors that decides if South Carolina or North Carolina ends up winning this game. So, to sum up everything that I talked about on today's show, again, you'll hear a lot about Spencer Rattler and Drake Maye and their quote-unquote head-to-head matchup all week this week. And again, no lie, I will be talking about it as well. But there are plenty of other things to pay attention to on both sides of the ball at the same time. So with that being said, that does it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are your thoughts on how people are using the narrative surrounding Spencer Rattler and Drake Maye and using that alone to make their predictions for this contest? And also, what storylines do you think people need to be talking about more regarding this matchup? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watched today's show on YouTube, or shoot me a direct message on Twitter at @aline_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. But once again, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Monday and a fantastic start to the work week and game week to kick off the 2023 football season. I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.